In the markets of late 19th century Athens, women sold small, milky white stones as good luck charms. They were carved from agate and carnelian no larger than a thumbnail, and each one bore strange symbols, tiny spirals figures with upraised arms, leaping animals pressed into the surface with a precision that seemed impossible for their age. The women who sold them did not know where they came from. They called them milk stones. But those faint marks, worn smooth by centuries of handling with the last visible fingerprints of Europe's first great civilization, a civilization so completely forgotten that even its name had to be invented by the man who dug it from the earth. That man was Arthur Evans, keeper of the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, and the trail of those stones led him to the island of Crete, a spine of limestone mountains set in the deep blue of the Mediterranean, halfway between Greece, Egypt, and the ancient Near East. What he found beneath an olive-covered hill near the town of Heraklion was not a single room or a buried temple. It was an entire world, a Bronze Age civilization that had built vast unfortified palaces, painted their walls with dolphins and lilies, worshipped powerful female deities, and commanded a fleet that may have made stone walls unnecessary. They vanished so thoroughly that for 3,000 years only one dark myth remembered them, at all the story of a monster in a maze. Tonight we'll move through 3 layers of what remains the stones they carved, the art they left on crumbling walls, and the silence where their language should be. The civilization we now call Minoan, a modern label drawn from the mythical king Minos, flourished on Crete for roughly 600 years during the Bronze Age. At its height sometime in the 17th century BC, it was arguably the most sophisticated culture in Europe, and yet when it finally fell, it left almost nothing behind that the later world could read. This is the central paradox of the Minoans. They were not a primitive people. They engineered drainage systems and flushing toilets. They built palaces that rose 5 stories from the hillside, connected by grand staircases and illuminated by open shafts that funneled daylight deep into interior rooms. Their potters produced ceramics so thin they are called eggshell ware, exported and prized from the Nile Delta to the coasts of the Levant. Their artisans carved scenes of extraordinary delicacy into gemstones smaller than a coin priestesses in ecstasy ships, with high curving sterns, bulls caught mid-charge. And yet we cannot hear them. Their native script, the writing system scholars call Linear A, has never been deciphered. We have the symbols, we have the tablets, but the sounds they represent, the prayers and inventories, and perhaps the names of gods remain locked behind a door for which no key has yet been found. What survives instead is something stranger, a kind of negative space. In all the frescoes recovered from their palace walls across decades of excavation, there are no scenes of military conquest, no triumphant kings standing over defeated enemies, no glorified warfare of any kind. This absence is striking enough on its own. But it becomes almost unsettling when you consider that every other major Bronze Age civilization, the Egyptians, the Hittites, the Assyrians, filled their monuments with exactly those images. The Minoans, it seems, chose not to, or perhaps they had no need. Some scholars have suggested that the Minoans lived in a state of prolonged internal stability, a Pax Minoa protected not by ramparts, but by the sea itself, their fleet reconstructed from frescoes found on the island of Thera, and from impressions on tiny seal stones appears to have been formidable sleek crescent-hulled ships, powered by sail and oar capable of controlling the sea lanes across the Aegean. If this interpretation holds, then the Minoans may have been the first true thalassocracy in European history, a civilization whose power rested entirely on the water. Their palaces stood open to the world because no enemy could reach them. It is a beautiful idea. It may also be incomplete. The absence of defensive walls does not necessarily prove the absence of conflict, and the art a culture chooses to make does not always reflect the full texture of its life. But the image persists, a civilization of open courtyards and painted dolphins of snake goddesses with unblinking eyes and young athletes leaping over the horns of charging bulls. A world that feels from this distance almost impossibly graceful. That world ended not with an invasion but with an eruption. Sometime in the late 17th or early 16th century BC, the precise date remains debated. the volcanic island of Thera, 70 miles north of Crete, tore itself apart in one of the most violent explosions in recorded human memory. The blast sent a column of ash more than 20 miles into the stratosphere. It generated tsunamis that struck the northern coast of Crete. It buried the Minoan settlement of Akrotiri under meters of pumice, preserving it like a Bronze Age Pompeii in almost perfect silence. For a long time, historians believed that eruption was the death blow, a single dramatic ending for a single dramatic civilization. But the archaeology tells a more complicated story. The heartland of Crete Knossos, the southern and western palaces, shows no significant ash layer from the event. The palaces were not levelled. Life continued diminished and wounded for perhaps another century and a half. What the volcano may have destroyed was not the buildings. It was the system, the fleet, the trade networks, the agricultural capacity of the eastern fields, and possibly something harder to measure, the confidence of a people whose religion was rooted in the beauty and generosity of the natural world. Into that weakened space came a younger, harder civilization from the Greek mainland, the Mycenaeans. They took what they admired, adapted what they could use, and let the rest fall into silence. Within a few generations, the language on the tablets at Knossos was no longer Minoan. It was Greek. And so a civilization that had flourished for centuries was compressed over time into a single myth, a story of a monster, a maze and a ball of thread. The palaces became the labyrinth, the bull-leaping ritual became the sacrifice, the great sea king became the tyrant Minos. What was once a living world became a cautionary tale told by the people who replaced it. Let us walk then through what the earth has given back: the painted walls, the silent tablets, the tiny stones still warm from the hands that carved them, and see what this forgotten civilization chose to leave behind. The only memory. 3,000 years after the last fire burned through the corridors of its greatest palace, the island of Crete possessed no written history of its own Bronze Age past. No chronicle survived, no king list, no temple inscription. What remained instead was a single story, dark, strange, and told not by the Cretans themselves, but by the mainland Greeks who had replaced them. It was the myth of the Minotaur. And for 30 centuries that myth was the only door left standing between the modern world and the civilization buried beneath the olive groves. The story, as it was told in the firelit halls of classical Athens, began with an act of pride. A powerful king named Minos ruled a great island empire from his palace at Knossos. To confirm his right to the throne, he prayed to the sea god Poseidon for a sign. Poseidon answered. From the waves emerged a magnificent white bull, perfect and sacred, meant to be sacrificed in the god's honour. But Minos looked at the animal and could not bring himself to destroy it. He kept the bull for his own herds and offered a lesser beast on the altar instead. The punishment for this insult was not swift, it was precise. Poseidon did not strike Minos down. Instead, he cursed the king's wife, Queen Pasiphae, with an unnatural desire for the sacred bull, and the result of that curse was something neither fully human nor fully animal. A creature with the body of a man and the head of a bull. They called it Asterion. The world would remember it as the Minotaur. What lingers in this myth is not just the monster, but the architecture built to contain it. Minos, horrified, summoned the master inventor Daedalus and commanded him to construct a prison from which the creature could never escape. Daedalus obliged. He built the labyrinth, a structure so vast and disorienting, so layered with false corridors and dead ends that anyone who entered would wander in darkness until the beast found them. The labyrinth was not merely a cage. It was a place designed to erase the possibility of return. And into that labyrinth, according to the myth, the conquered city of Athens was forced to send a tribute 7 young men and 7 young women every year to be devoured. The detail matters not because it is literally true, but because it preserves something. A memory of young people sent to Crete, a memory of a ritual involving a bull, a memory of a structure so complex it swallowed those who entered it. These are not the kinds of details myth invents from nothing. They cling to something older. The hero of the story, of course, was Theseus, the son of the Athenian king, who volunteered to enter the labyrinth and kill the monster. He succeeded, but not through strength alone. The princess Ariadne, daughter of Minos himself, fell in love with Theseus and gave him 2 gifts: a sword to fight the bull and a ball of thread to unwind behind him as he walked. It was the thread, not the weapon, that saved him. After slaying the Minotaur in the suffocating dark, Theseus followed the thin line back through the maze and into the light. He escaped Crete. The tribute ended. The labyrinth fell silent. For the classical Greeks, this was a story about heroism and liberation, the triumph of Athens over an older, stranger power. But underneath the narrative scaffolding, something else persists. The myth remembers Crete as the seat of a great empire. It remembers Minos not as a minor chieftain, but as a ruler of the sea, powerful enough to subjugate the proudest city on the mainland. It remembers a palace so intricate it could only be described as a maze. And it remembers at the centre of everything a bull. None of this was taken seriously for most of Western history. The Minotaur was a fable, a labyrinth, a poetic invention, and Minos a figure no more historical than Zeus. Scholars of the 18th and 19th centuries treated the myths of the Greek Bronze Age as charming literature with no archaeological foundation. There was no reason to believe that anything lay beneath the soil of Crete except the same rock and root one found anywhere else in the Mediterranean. But myths do not survive 3 millennia by accident. Something holds them in place, some gravitational pull of half-remembered truth. The Greeks themselves seem to sense this. Their historians from Thucydides onward spoke of Minos as a real king who had established the first thalassocracy, the first empire built on the control of the sea. They described him not as a tyrant feeding children to a monster, but as a lawgiver and a naval commander who cleared the Aegean of pirates. There were, it seemed, 2 versions of the same figure, the dark mythological king and the pragmatic historical one. They could not both be entirely true, but perhaps neither was entirely invented. The distance between myth and evidence is not always as wide as it appears. In the late 19th century, a German businessman named Heinrich Schliemann had already demonstrated this by digging into a hill in western Turkey and finding what he believed to be the ruins of Homer's Troy. If the Iliad could lead a man to a real city, could the myth of the Minotaur lead someone to a real palace? One man believed it could. And by the spring of 1900 he had purchased the hill where that palace was said to be buried, hired over 100 labourers and stood ready to begin digging. What he would find in the first week alone would be enough to rewrite the prehistory of Europe. But the full scope of what lay beneath that quiet sun-warmed earth would take decades to understand, and in some ways it has never been fully understood at all. The man with a magnifying glass. The objects that changed Arthur Evans' life were small enough to fit in the palm of his hand. They were ancient seal stones carved from agate, carnelian and jasper, and he first encountered them not in a museum vault or an excavation trench, but in the dusty stalls of Athenian antique dealers in the early 1890s. Each stone was barely larger than a fingernail, yet, under the magnifying glass Evans carried everywhere, his eyesight was poor at distance, but his close vision was almost unnaturally sharp. They revealed scenes of startling intricacy, tiny figures in this elaborate dress, animals caught mid-leap, and most importantly rows of small precise symbols that looked like nothing he had seen in any known script. Evans was not yet thinking about palaces or labyrinths. He was thinking about language. Those symbols he believed were evidence of a writing system older than any form of Greek, a script that belonged to a civilization Europe had not yet learned to name. Evans was by the standards of his time an unusual figure. He held the prestigious position of keeper of the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, which gave him academic authority, but he was not a conventional scholar content to work from libraries and publish catalogues. He was restless, physically brave, and possessed of a private fortune inherited from his father, a successful industrialist and amateur archaeologist. This combination of intellectual obsession and personal wealth would prove decisive. Where other researchers saw bureaucratic obstacles, land disputes. Ottoman permits the reluctance of local landowners, Evans saw problems that money and patience could solve. He had already travelled widely in the Balkans, reporting on political unrest for the Manchester Guardian with the same sharp eye. He later turned on Bronze Age pottery. He was a man who trusted his own judgment, absolutely a quality that made him both visionary and at times dangerously certain. The trail of the seal stones led him to Crete, an island that in the 1890s was still emerging from centuries of Ottoman rule. The landscape was rugged and largely unexcavated, its ancient past buried under layers of neglect and political instability. Evans travelled the countryside buying more stones from villagers, cataloguing each one, mapping the locations where they surfaced most frequently. The evidence converged on a single site, a broad low hill covered with olive trees near the town of Heraklion, a place the locals called Kefala. Others had suspected this hill before him. Heinrich Schliemann, fresh from his triumphant excavations at Troy and Mycenae, had visited Crete and identified Kefala as the probable site of ancient Knossos. But Schliemann could never secure the rights to dig there. The land was divided among multiple owners, and negotiations collapsed repeatedly. Evans succeeded where Schliemann had failed, not through superior archaeology, but through superior stubbornness. Over several years of patient dealing, he purchased the entire hill outright. By 1899, the land was his, and with it, whatever lay beneath. The excavation began on March the 23rd, 1900, with a crew of more than 100 local workmen. The first days produced what large-scale digs often produce: dust sweat, and the tops of walls whose purpose could not yet be determined. Massive stone blocks emerged from the soil, suggesting a structure of considerable size, but size alone meant little. Crete was littered with the ruins of Venetian fortresses and Roman villas. What Evans needed was evidence of something older, something that did not belong to any known period of Mediterranean history. That evidence arrived within the first week, and it arrived in colour. A workman's pickaxe struck a patch of soft material embedded in the earth, and when the surrounding soil was carefully brushed away, a fragment of painted plaster emerged, vivid reds, blues and ochres preserved in the dry Cretan ground for more than 3,000 years. As the fragment grew into a panel, a figure took shape, a life-sized young man with long black curling hair, a slender waist and a noble profile, carrying a tall conical vessel in both hands. This was the cupbearer fresco, and its implications were immediate. The painting was not crude or archaic. It displayed a confidence of line, a sophistication of colour, and a naturalism of form that placed it among the finest art of the ancient world. Whatever civilization had produced this image, it was not primitive, not provincial, and not anything Evans had expected to find. Within days, the discoveries accelerated. Following the plastered walls deeper into the hillside, the team uncovered a small sunken room with gypsum benches lining its walls, and set against the north side a high-backed chair carved from a single block of alabaster, graceful, undulating, unmistakably a seat of authority. The walls surrounding it were painted with paired griffins lying in a field of lilies flanking the empty throne like supernatural sentinels. Evans, steeped since childhood in the Greek myths, did not hesitate. He declared it the throne room of King Minoans himself. The identification was dramatic, perhaps premature, and certainly unprovable, but the instinct behind it that this was a place of ceremonial power, that whoever sat in that chair commanded something vast, was not unreasonable. The throne remains today where Evans found it, the oldest known throne in Europe, still standing in its original position, and no subsequent interpretation has entirely displaced his initial conviction that it was built for someone who ruled. What Evans could not yet see in those first exhilarating weeks was the full extent of what lay beneath the hill. The throne room was a single chamber in a structure that would eventually reveal itself to be over 6 acres in size, more than 1,000 interconnected rooms, halls, storerooms, workshops, and shrines built on multiple levels down the slope of the Kepler Ridge. He had come to Crete looking for a few scratched symbols on ancient stones. He was beginning to realize that he had found something far larger and far stranger than a language. He had found the heart of a world that history had completely misplaced. But the palace, for all its grandeur, would raise as many questions as it answered, beginning with the most unsettling one of all: why in an age when every great power in the known world hid behind massive fortifications, did this one stand open to the wind, a world without walls? Of all the details that emerged from the excavation at Knossos, the one that troubled archaeologists most was not something they found. It was something that was entirely absent. There were no fortification walls, no defensive towers, no narrow fortified gateways designed to funnel attackers into killing zones. In an age when the Hittites ringed their capital at Hattusa with double walls and projecting bastions, when the Egyptians constructed massive frontier fortresses along the Nile, and when even modest Canaanite towns sheltered behind circuits of mud, brick and stone, the palace at Knossos stood open, Its entrances were wide. Its courtyards flowed into the surrounding town without obstruction. Its western facade faced a broad public square that appeared designed not to repel crowds, but to gather them. For a structure that clearly housed enormous wealth storerooms packed with enormous clay jars, workshops producing fine metalwork and carved ivory. This openness was not merely unusual, it was by the standards of the Bronze Age almost incomprehensible. Evans noticed this absence early and was deeply struck by it. As the excavation expanded across the full 6-acre footprint of the palace, the pattern only became more pronounced. Knossos was not built like a citadel. It was built like a city turned inward on itself, organised around a great rectangular central courtyard that measured roughly 50 metres long and 25 metres wide, a vast open-air stage paved with flagstones, surrounded on all sides by the rising stories of the palace complex. This courtyard was clearly the heart of the entire structure, the space where the public and private worlds of the Minoan elite converged. Religious processions would have moved through it. Officials and priests would have observed from the upper balconies, and it was here most scholars believed that the most spectacular and dangerous of all Minoan rituals, the bull leaping, was performed before assembled crowds. The court was not a defensive space. It was a theatrical one designed to be seen to amplify ceremony, to place the rituals of power on full display. The architecture that radiated outward from this central court was unlike anything Evans or his contemporaries had encountered in the ancient Mediterranean. The palace did not follow a single axis or a symmetrical plan. Instead, it grew organically down the slope of the Kafala hill in a dense interlocking web of rooms, corridors, light wells, staircases, and colonnaded halls that seemed to fold back on themselves without obvious logic. Some sections rose to 4 or 5 stories. Staircases descended into lower levels that opened onto unexpected courtyards flooded with daylight from above. The famous Grand Staircase, one of the great engineering achievements of the Bronze Age, descended through multiple flights to the residential quarters on the eastern side. Its wide stone steps flanked by tapered wooden columns, painted in the distinctive Minoan red. Light wells, essentially open shafts cut through the building's mass, channeled both sunlight and ventilation into rooms that would otherwise have been buried in permanent darkness. It was a solution of remarkable elegance, a way to build dense and deep, without sacrificing the air and luminosity that the Minoan aesthetic clearly demanded. To walk through the reconstructed corridors today is to understand viscerally why the later Greeks remembered this place as a labyrinth. There is no grand central hallway. Passages turn without warning. A corridor that seems to lead outward instead curves back toward the interior. Rooms open into other rooms that open onto staircases descending to levels you did not know existed. Evans himself remarked on the disorienting quality of the plan, and he was the man who had spent years mapping it. For a stranger arriving from the ordered axial architecture of Egypt or the compact hilltop fortresses of the Greek mainland Knossos, would have been genuinely bewildering, a building that seemed to have no beginning and no end, where every turn revealed another passage, and every passage led deeper into the structure's maze-like core. The connection to the myth was for Evans irresistible. The labyrinth of legend he proposed was not a subterranean dungeon. It was the palace itself, so vast and so complex that it became in the memory of those who visited it a place from which one could not return. But if the labyrinth was the palace, then the question of the missing walls becomes even more pointed. This was not a minor settlement or a rural villa. Knossos was the administrative, religious, and economic centre of the most powerful civilization in the pre-Greek Aegean. Its storerooms, which Evans called the magazines, contained rows upon rows of enormous clay storage jars per thusum, standing taller, than a man with a combined capacity estimated at over 200,000 gallons of olive oil, wine and grain. This was surplus on a staggering scale, the kind of concentrated wealth that in every other Bronze Age context attracted raids, sieges and wars of conquest. Yet there were no walls to protect it. The magazine stood just meters from the open western court, separated from the outside world by nothing more than a few doorways and the palace's own internal corridors. The same pattern repeated at other major Minoan sites across the island. At Paistos, set on a commanding ridge overlooking the fertile Massara plain in southern Crete, a second great palace smaller than Knossos, but equally sophisticated, stood without fortifications. At Maelia, on the northern coast east of Knossos, a third palace complex opened directly onto the surrounding settlement, with no defensive perimeter of any kind. This was not a local anomaly or an accident of one site's geography. It was a consistent island-wide architectural choice that persisted for centuries. Wherever the Minoans built their centres of power, they built them open. And this pattern, this quiet, persistent absence, suggests something about the Minoan world that no single artifact or fresco can convey on its own. It suggests a civilization that for a remarkably long period either faced no serious military threat or had found a way to neutralize such threats before they ever reached the shore. That possibility that the Minoans had devised a form of security that made walls redundant leads us away from the architecture and toward the sea, because the answer to the riddle of the unfortified palaces may not be found in the stones of Knossos at all. It may be found in the ships that once filled its harbours and in the vast blue expanse of water that surrounded the island on every side. The wooden walls. On a fragment of painted plaster recovered from the ruined city of Akrotiri on the island of Thera, there is a scene that no other Bronze Age civilization left behind. It is known as the Flotilla fresco, and it depicts a magnificent fleet of ships sailing between two coastal towns, in what appears to be a ceremonial procession or a triumphant homecoming. The vessels are long and elegant crescents shaped with high curving sterns that rise like the necks of swans. Some are powered by banks of oars, their rowers pulling in unison. Others carry their sails furled, gliding on calm water past towns, whose buildings are rendered in miniature multi-storied houses with windows, balconies and rooftop terraces. Dolphins leap in the waters around the hulls. People line the shore to watch. The entire scene radiates not military menace but civic pride, the portrait of a culture that understood the sea not as a barrier, but as the connective tissue of its world. This single fresco, preserved under meters of volcanic ash, may be the clearest image we possess of the force that made the Minoan palaces possible, and that made their walls unnecessary. The ancient Greek historian Thucydides, writing more than 1,000 years after the Minoan era, recorded a tradition that King Minos of Crete had been the first ruler to establish a thalassocracy, a dominion built on the control of the sea. Minos, Thucydides wrote, had assembled a great navy, suppressed piracy in the Aegean, and established his sons as governors on the surrounding islands. For centuries, modern scholars treated this passage as little more than legend dressed in historical language. But the archaeology of the 20th century has made it increasingly difficult to dismiss. The unfortified palaces, the island-wide network of harbours, the evidence of far-flung trade, all of it points toward a civilization whose primary instrument of power was not the army, but the fleet. The Minoans, it appears, did not merely use the sea, they ruled it. And that rule was the foundation on which everything else, the art, the religion, the wealth, the confidence was built. The evidence for Minoan maritime reach is scattered across the eastern Mediterranean like a trail of breadcrumbs dropped from the deck of a ship. Minoan pottery, particularly the exquisite Kamara's ware of the earlier palace period with its eggshell-thin walls and swirling polychrome designs, has been found in Egypt in the coastal cities of the Levant on the islands of Rhodes and Kythera, and at dozens of sites across the Aegean. These were not cheap trade goods. Kamara's ware was a luxury product prized for its technical sophistication, and its beauty, and its presence in foreign contexts tells us that Minoan goods travelled far and were received with respect. In the other direction, raw materials flowed back to Crete copper from Cyprus tin, from Anatolia gold and ivory from Egypt lapis lazuli, from sources as distant as Afghanistan, passing through multiple intermediaries before reaching the workshops at Knossos. The palace magazines, with their vast stores of olive oil and wine, now make a different kind of sense. They were not merely larders for a royal household. They were the warehouses of a trading empire stockpiling the island's most valuable exports, the liquid wealth that Minoan ships carried across the sea in large clay jars sealed with the distinctive stamps of the palace administration. The most striking confirmation of Minoan standing in the wider Bronze Age world comes not from Crete itself, but from the painted walls of Egyptian tombs. In the tomb of Rekhmir, a powerful vizier who served under Pharaoh Thutmose III in the 15th century BC, A procession of foreign emissaries is depicted bringing tribute or gifts to the Egyptian court. Among them is a group of men labelled in hieroglyphic text as the Keftiu, a name most scholars now identify with the people of Crete. The figures are unmistakably Minoan. They wear the characteristic patterned kilts and codpieces seen in the frescoes at Knossos. Their hair is long, dark, and elaborately curled, and the objects they carry include recognisable Minoan luxury goods, bull-headed drinking vessels of gold, long-necked jugs of distinctive form, and what appear to be finely worked metal bowls. This is not myth or inference. It is a visual record created by an outside civilization, showing that the Minoans were known, recognised, and considered significant enough to appear in the most prestigious artistic contexts of the ancient world. They were players on the international stage, trading and negotiating with the most powerful kingdom on earth. But the Minoan relationship with the sea went beyond commerce. It shaped the very pattern of their expansion. Rather than conquering large territories on the mainland, the Minoans projected their culture outward through a network of island settlements and trading colonies that extended across the southern Aegean. The most fully excavated of these is Akrotiri on Thera, a prosperous town of multi-storied stone houses, indoor plumbing, and walls painted with frescoes in the full Minoan style. Akrotiri was not a military outpost. It was a thriving community of merchants, artisans, and sailors, a Minoan city in miniature transplanted to a volcanic island 70 miles north of Crete. Other settlements with strong Minoan characteristics have been identified on roads on Kythera, off the southern tip of the Greek mainland, and at Miletus on the coast of Anatolia. Together, these sites suggest not a formal empire in the modern sense, but a sphere of cultural and commercial influence, a web of ports and harbours connected by the ships that were the true infrastructure of Minoan power. This is perhaps the deepest explanation for the mystery of the missing walls. The Minoans did not lack defences. They simply built them from wood instead of stone. Their fleet was their fortification, mobile, flexible, and capable of intercepting any threat long before it reached the harbours of Crete. A rival force attempting to cross the open Aegean with an invasion fleet would have been vulnerable for days, visible from island lookout posts, and subject to attack by Minoan warships operating from their network of bases. Static walls protect a single point. A navy protects an entire perimeter. And for the Minoans, that perimeter was the sea itself, hundreds of miles of open water that no Bronze Age army could cross without being detected and in all likelihood destroyed. The contrast with the Mycenaean world of the Greek mainland could not be sharper. The Mycenaeans built their palaces inside Cyclopean fortresses' walls so massive that later generations believed only giants could have constructed them. Their architecture spoke of constant threat of a world where danger came overland and could arrive without warning. The Minoan world faced outward toward the horizon, confident that whatever came across the water could be met and mastered before it ever touched the shore. That confidence, sustained across centuries, created the conditions for something rare in the ancient world, a prolonged period of internal stability, an era some scholars have called the Pax Minoa, during which the creative energies of the civilization could be directed not toward survival, but toward beauty. And it is to that beauty painted on wet plaster, fired into clay, carved into gemstones, that we now turn. The language of colour. No pigment lasts 3,000 years by accident. The Minoan fresco survived because of a technique that demanded perfection on the first attempt. The method is called buon fresco, true fresco, and it requires the artist to apply a pigment directly onto freshly laid lime plaster, while the surface is still wet. As the plaster dries, a chemical reaction occurs. The calcium hydroxide in the lime absorbs carbon dioxide from the air and converts to calcium carbonate, a crystalline mineral layer that locks the pigment permanently into the wall itself. The colour does not sit on the surface, it becomes part of the stone. But the window for working is mercilessly short. Once the plaster begins to set a process that can take as little as a few hours depending on temperature and humidity, no further changes are possible. There is no erasing, no overpainting, no correcting a misplaced line. Every stroke must be placed with certainty the first time. The Minoan painters worked under this pressure with a fluency that still startles conservators who study their brushwork today. The confidence visible in their lines is not merely artistic. It is technical, the product of a tradition refined over centuries and passed from master to apprentice, with a discipline that the finished surfaces barely reveal. The grandest expression of this tradition greeted visitors at the very entrance to the Palace of Knossos. The procession fresco fragments of which were recovered from the long western corridor depicted an extended line of figures, young men and women walking in formal arrangement against a deep red background, carrying ceremonial vessels and offerings towards some unseen destination deeper within the palace. The figures are rendered at life-size, their proportions elegant and slightly elongated, their posture upright, their faces shown in the Egyptian convention of profile view, but with a naturalism of expression that is entirely Minoan. The men wear elaborately patterned kilts cinched at the waist. The women, where fragments survive, appear in the fitted open-bodiced dress that is one of the most distinctive features of Minoan fashion. Leading the procession is the figure Evans's team uncovered in the first week of excavation, the cupbearer. A young man carrying a tall conical return with both hands, his long black hair falling in carefully rendered curls against his shoulders. He walks with a solemn grace that seems to belong not to a servant but to a participant in something sacred. The fresco was clearly designed to prepare the visitor psychologically for what lay beyond, to slow the pace, to formalize the transition from the public world of the Western Court into the ceremonial interior of the palace. It was architecture and painting working together as a single instrument of ritual atmosphere. Deeper within the palace, the art shifts register. In the residential quarters on the eastern slope, the area Evans designated the Queen's Megaron, the walls carried a very different kind of image. Here a troop of blue dolphins leaps through a stylized sea filled with small fish and delicately rendered sea urchins. The colours are vivid, deep blues, warm ochres, touches of pale yellow, and the movement is fluid, almost playful. There is no ceremony in this painting, no religious solemnity, no display of rank or power. It is by every measure a work of pure delight, an image designed to bring the beauty of the sea into a room that looked inward rather than out toward the coast. The dolphin fresco has become perhaps the single, most recognizable image from the Minoan world, reproduced on postcards and museum catalogues so frequently that its strangeness has been dulled by familiarity. But the strangeness is real. In every other palace culture of the Bronze Age in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in the Hittite lands, the walls of royal apartments were decorated with images of gods of military victories of the king's divine authority. The Minoans, in what appears to have been their most intimate domestic space, chose dolphins. The detail is small in a sense, but it refuses to go away. It suggests a set of values so different from those of their contemporaries that it resists easy comparison. From the same palace came a fragment that Evans with characteristic flair nicknamed La Parisienne, the Parisian woman for her seemingly modern elegance. The painting shows the face and upper body of a young woman with elaborately curled hair, a large dark eye outlined with striking precision, full red lips slightly parted in what might be a smile, and at the nape of her neck a large sacral knot tied in a ritual fashion. She's rendered with a confidence and intimacy that feels almost like portraiture, though whether she represents a goddess, a priestess, or a court figure of high status remains unknown. What is certain is that the artist who painted her was interested in personality, in capturing something specific about this particular face rather than reproducing a generic ideal. That impulse toward individuality is rare in Bronze Age art, and its presence here suggests a culture that valued the particular human being, not just the symbolic role. The same artistic sensibility extended beyond the palace walls and onto the curved surfaces of Minoan pottery. During the earlier palace period, Minoan potters developed a style now known as Kamaris ware, named after the sacred cave on Mount Ida, where examples were first discovered. These vessels are among the most technically accomplished ceramics produced anywhere in the ancient world. Their walls are extraordinarily thin, sometimes barely 2 millimeters, yet they hold their form with a precision that speaks to complete mastery of the potter's wheel. The decoration is applied in white, red, and orange pigments over a glossy black slip, creating patterns of spirals, rosettes, and abstracted organic forms that seem to rotate around the vessel as the eye follows them. It is an art of movement and energy, almost hypnotic in its rhythmic repetition, and it was prized far beyond the shores of Crete. Kamaris ware has been found in Egyptian tombs in the palaces of the Levant, and across the Aegean, a luxury export that carried Minoan aesthetic values, wherever Minoan ships could reach. In the later palace period, the decorative tradition shifted from abstraction toward a startling naturalism. The so-called marine style, which flourished in the 15th century BC, turned the surface of each vessel into a miniature seascape. The most celebrated example is a flask found at the eastern Cretan site of Pellicastro, on which a single octopus wraps its 8 tentacles organically around the entire body of the vessel, its suckers rendered with careful attention, its form perfectly adapted to the globular shape of the clay. Seaweed, coral and sea urchins fill the remaining space, creating a complete underwater composition that transforms the object from a container into a small held world. It's the same impulse visible in the dolphin fresco, the desire to bring the living sea into the human space to dissolve the boundary between the made and the natural, but expressed here in a form intimate enough to rest in the palm of a hand. And it is in these smallest objects, as we shall see, that the Minoans embedded not only their artistry, but the machinery of their administration, their identity, and perhaps even their faith. What the silence does not prove. It is tempting, after walking through the painted corridors and open courtyards of the Minoan world, to settle into a comfortable narrative, a civilization of peace, of beauty, of enlightened feminine spirituality, flourishing in gentle contrast to the violent empires that surrounded it. The image is appealing. It has persisted in popular writing and museum displays for over a century. But the historian's task is not to find the most beautiful story. It is to ask whether the evidence actually supports the story being told. And when we press on certain elements of the Minoan narrative, gently without hostility but with honest attention, some of the foundations feel less solid than they first appeared. The most persistent claim about Minoan civilization is that it was fundamentally peaceful. The argument rests on 2 pillars: the absence of fortification walls at the major palace sites and the absence of military imagery in Minoan art. Both observations are factually correct. The palaces at Knossos, Phaistos and Mallia were indeed unfortified, and the surviving frescoes do indeed contain no scenes of battle, no images of conquering kings, no depictions of defeated enemies in the manner of Egyptian or Assyrian art. But absence of evidence, as the old archaeological maxim reminds us, is not evidence of absence. The Minoans controlled a powerful navy. They maintained a network of settlements across the Aegean. They administered a complex bureaucratic system capable of tracking vast quantities of commodities. These are not the characteristics of a society that had no capacity for organized violence. A fleet that can protect trade routes can also blockade them. A navy that can intercept pirates can also project coercive power against weaker neighbors. The fact that the Minoans chose not to depict warfare in their palace art may tell us something about their values, their religious conventions, or their propaganda, but it does not necessarily tell us that warfare did not occur. Some scholars have pointed out that the art a civilization produces for its ceremonial spaces is always selective, always idealized. The Egyptians filled their temples with images of military triumph, but they did not depict the famine disease and administrative corruption that also characterized their history. Every culture paints the portrait it wishes to be remembered by. The question of women's status in Minoan society carries a similar tension between evidence and interpretation. Arthur Evans, struck by the prominence of female figures in Minoan religious art, the snake goddesses, the priestesses leading rituals, the women depicted in positions of authority on seal stones and frescoes, concluded that Minoan society was a matriarchy, a civilization in which women held not only spiritual but political power. The idea captured the public imagination and has never entirely released it. Yet the evidence examined closely is more ambiguous than Evans believed. Women are certainly prominent in ceremonial and religious contexts, but ceremonial prominence and political authority are not the same thing. In many historical societies, women have served as priestesses, oracles, and ritual leaders, while formal governance remained in male hands. The linear tablets which might have clarified the administrative structure of the palaces remain undeciphered, and until they are read, the question of who actually governed the Minoan state cannot be definitively answered. Most modern scholars have stepped back from Evans' matriarchy hypothesis without dismissing the underlying observation. Women in Minoan Crete clearly occupied a position of unusual visibility and respect, compared to their counterparts in Egypt, Mesopotamia, or later Greece. But how that visibility translated into the daily mechanics of power remains an open question, one that the silence of the script keeps firmly unresolved. Then there is the matter of Evans himself, and the degree to which the Minoan world we see today is filtered through the lens of his personality and his era. When Evans encountered the fragile, crumbling ruins of Knossos exposed to rain-wind and the harsh Cretan sun, he made a decision that would shape the site forever. He reconstructed. Using reinforced concrete, the modern industrial material of his time, he rebuilt the grand staircase, re-erected the tapered red columns, and commissioned artists to repaint the frescoes on the restored walls. His stated purpose was preservation to protect the delicate gypsum and plaster from disintegrating in the open air. But the result was something more than conservation. It was interpretation. Every reconstruction involved choices: where to place a column, how high to raise a wall, what colours to use in restoring a fresco that survived only in fragments. Evans was guided by his considerable knowledge, but also by his instincts, his aesthetic preferences, and the romantic conviction that he was restoring the palace of a legendary king. Some of his reconstructions, particularly the painted restorations of frescoes, have been questioned by later scholars, who believe the original fragments were too incomplete to support the compositions Evans authorised. The famous dolphin fresco, for instance, was reconstructed from scattered pieces, and some archaeologists have suggested it may originally have been a floor decoration, rather than a wall painting, a difference that would change how we understand the room it adorned. None of this means Evans was wrong in his broad conclusions. The palace is real. The civilization is real. The art, even in its fragmentary state, is extraordinary. But the visitor to Knossos today sees not simply a Bronze Age ruin. They see a ruin as imagined by an Edwardian Englishman, and the line between discovery and invention is not always easy to trace. These uncertainties do not diminish the Minoan achievement. If anything, they deepen it. A civilization that resists easy narrative, that refuses to fit comfortably into our categories of war and peace, patriarchy and matriarchy, fact and myth. Such a civilization is more interesting, not less, for its refusal to be pinned down. The discomfort we feel in the gaps is not a flaw in the evidence. It is the evidence reminding us that 3,500 years of silence cannot be filled by confidence alone. And it is with that silence, the literal silence of an unread script, that the next layer of the Minoan mystery begins. The scripts that will not speak. Among the thousands of objects recovered from the palace at Knossos, the ones that mattered most to Arthur Evans were not the golden jewellery, not the painted frescoes, not even the throne itself. They were flat, roughly pillow-shaped tablets of sun-dried clay, most no larger than the palm of a hand, found in small chambers that had clearly served as archive rooms. These were the administrative records of the palace inventories, personnel lists, accounts of goods received and distributed, and they were covered in rows of small, neatly incised symbols that represented a system of writing older than any known form of Greek. Evans had come to Crete looking for exactly this evidence of a literate civilization predating the classical world. The seal stones in the Athenian markets had been the bait. The tablets were the prize. But the prize came with a lock that neither Evans nor anyone in his lifetime could open. The symbols were clear, the handwriting often elegant, but the language they encoded was completely unknown. The tablets could be held, photographed, catalogued and admired. They could not be read. As Evans sorted through the hundreds of fragments recovered across multiple seasons of excavation, he identified two distinct scripts. The older of the two, which he found throughout the palace in contexts associated with the height of Minoan culture, he named Linear A. Its symbols were fluid and curved, written from left to right, and appeared on tablets, pottery and stone, offering tables found not only at Knossos but at Minoan sites across the island. Phaistos Malia Zakros, and the sacred cave of Psychro high on the Lassithi plateau. Linear A was clearly the native writing system of the Minoan civilization, the script in which they conducted their daily business, recorded their offerings, and presumably, though we cannot prove it, composed whatever prayers or hymns their religion required. It remains undeciphered to this day. We can identify the numerical system with reasonable confidence. We can recognize certain ideograms, pictographic signs for commodities like grain oil, wine and livestock that function as visual shorthand alongside the phonetic symbols. but the phonetic values themselves, the actual sounds the symbols represent, have resisted every systematic attempt at decipherment. The language behind Linear A is not Greek. It is not related to any known language family with sufficient certainty to serve as a key. It stands alone, a closed system, beautiful and mute. The younger script, which Evans named Linear B, told a different story, though it would take half a century for that story to emerge. Linear B tablets were found only in the final destruction layer at Knossos, the stratum associated with the very last phase of the palace's existence. The script shared many signs with Linear A, but was clearly distinct, slightly more angular, slightly more standardized, as if the older system had been adapted for a different language. Evans assumed, not unreasonably, that Linear B was simply a later development of the Minoan writing tradition, still encoding the same unknown Minoan language. He was wrong, but the proof of his error would not come until after his death, and it would come from an unexpected quarter, not from an established professor of ancient languages, but from a young English architect with a gift for pattern recognition and a boyhood obsession that had never released its grip. Michael Ventris first encountered the Linear B tablets at the age of 14 during a school visit to an exhibition at the Royal Institution in London, where Arthur Evans himself was lecturing. The experience fixed itself in the boy's mind with the force of a vocation, through his school years and into his training as an architect, through his service as a navigator in the Royal Air Force. During the Second World War, Ventris returned again and again to the puzzle of the undeciphered script. He corresponded with scholars. He devised elaborate grids tracking the frequency and distribution of individual signs. He applied techniques of statistical analysis that owed as much to wartime code-breaking as to classical philology. And in 1952, working largely alone, he achieved what generations of professional linguists had failed to do. He broke the code of Linear B. The key was an assumption that most scholars had dismissed as improbable, that the language behind Linear B was not Minoan at all, but an early form of Greek. When Ventris tested this hypothesis, plugging Greek phonetic values derived from known Cretan place names into the Linear B sign grid, the tablets began to yield recognizable words, archaic, unfamiliar in form, but unmistakably Greek. The decipherment was confirmed independently by the Cambridge scholar John Chadwick, and together they published their findings in a landmark paper that rewrote the linguistic history of the Bronze Age. The implications were profound and immediate. If the language of Linear B was Greek, then the people who had written the final tablets at Knossos were not Minoans. They were Mycenaeans, the Greek-speaking warriors of the mainland, who had long been known from the shaft graves of Mycenae and the Cyclopean walls of Tiryns. The tablets confirmed what some archaeologists had already suspected, that in its last phase, the palace at Knossos had been taken over by a Mycenaean administration Greek-speaking rulers who had adopted the older Minoan bureaucratic system and adapted its script to record their own language. The great palace had not simply fallen, it had changed hands, and the records of its final masters baked hard in the fire that ultimately destroyed the building had survived as accidental testimony to that transfer of power. But the decipherment of Linear B, for all its brilliance, illuminated only one side of the divide. The Mycenaean tablets could be read, and what they revealed was largely mundane lists of chariot wheels, inventories of bronze vessels, rations allocated to groups of women workers. The older script Linear A, the true voice of the Minoan civilization, remained exactly where it had been before, visible, tangible, and perfectly silent. And then there was one object that belonged to neither script, an artifact so singular that it seemed to exist outside every known system of classification, a small clay disc found in the ruins of a palace on the other side of the island, stamped with symbols that no one has ever seen anywhere else. The goddess and the earth. In the summer of 1908, in the ruins of the Palace of Phaistos on the southern coast of Crete, an Italian archaeologist named Luigi Pernier lifted a small fired clay disc from the earth of a basement storage room. It was roughly 15 centimeters in diameter, about the size of a saucer, and both of its faces were covered in a tight spiral of symbols, 241 individual impressions arranged in groups divided by incised lines. The symbols were unlike anything found on the Linear A or Linear B tablets. There were human heads, walking figures, animals, plants, tools and geometric shapes, 45 distinct signs in total, and they had not been scratched or painted onto the clay. They had been stamped, each one pressed into the wet surface with a tiny individual punch before the disc was fired hard. The implication was quietly astonishing. This was a form of movable type of technology of repeatable mechanical printing applied to clay more than 3,000 years before Gutenberg. The Phaistos disc remains unique. No other object bearing the same script has ever been found at any site in any context. Its language, its purpose, and its origin are completely unknown. It sits today in the Heraklion Archaeological Museum in a case of its own, a perfect circle of silence, an object that belongs to the Minoan world, and yet stands outside everything we think we understand about it. The disc is an extreme case, but the condition it represents is not unusual. The Minoans left no religious texts, no mythological narratives, no hymns or prayers that we can read. Their spiritual world must be reconstructed entirely from what they made and where they placed it from the figurines buried in hidden pits. The offerings left on mountaintops and the recurring images painted and carved across centuries of artistic production. It is an act of interpretation conducted in near-total textual darkness, and every conclusion drawn from it carries the weight of that uncertainty. But the patterns, though mute, are remarkably consistent, and the most striking pattern of all is the overwhelming prominence of the female form in Minoan religious imagery. Across frescoes, seal stones, signet rings, and sculpted figurines, women dominate the sacred space of the Minoan world. They are shown standing at altars with arms raised in gestures of invocation. They are depicted seated on thrones receiving offerings from smaller attendant figures. They lead processions, preside over rituals, and occupy the central position in compositions where men, when they appear at all, serve as musicians, worshippers, or subordinate participants. This pattern is not confined to a single site or a single period. It persists across the full geographic and chronological range of Minoan civilization, from the early palace period through the final centuries before the Mycenaean takeover. Whatever the Minoans believed about the divine, the face they gave it was overwhelmingly female. The most famous and most powerful expression of this tradition was found by Arthur Evans in 1903 in a stone-lined pit beneath the floor of a small room at Knossos, a deposit he called the Temple Repositories. Among votive objects, shells and fragments of gold foil. His team uncovered a set of faience figurines that would become the most iconic images of the Minoan world. The largest, the figure known universally as the snake goddess, stands roughly 34 centimeters tall, her arms extended outward, a writhing snake gripped firmly in each hand. Additional serpents coil around her forearms and across her body. She wears the elaborate Minoan court dress, a tightly fitted bodice, open at the front to expose both breasts and a long-layered flounced skirt that falls to her feet. Atop her tall headdress sits a small feline, possibly a leopard, or a wild cat, gazing outward with calm authority. Her own eyes are wide, dark and unblinking, fixed on the viewer, with an intensity that has not diminished across 35 centuries. She's an image of concentrated power, and every element of her composition carries symbolic weight. The exposed breasts signify fertility and nourishment, the fundamental life-giving force. The snakes, creatures that live within the earth and shed their skin in a cycle of apparent death and renewal, are among the oldest symbols of regeneration and chthonic power in the ancient world. The feline marks her as a figure of dominion over the animal kingdom, a mistress of wild nature. Together, these elements compose a figure that scholars have interpreted as a great earth goddess, or more cautiously as a priestess embodying the attributes of such a goddess in ritual performance. The places where the Minoans worshipped reinforced this connection between divinity and the natural world. Unlike the Egyptians, who built colossal stone temples to house their gods, the Minoans appear to have found the sacred primarily in the landscape itself. On the highest peaks of Crete, including Mount Juktas, which rises directly south of Knossos, and would have been visible from the palace's upper stories, archaeologists have discovered open-air sanctuaries, where ordinary Minoans climbed on pilgrimage to leave offerings. Thousands of small clay figurines have been recovered from these peak sanctuaries, images of men and women in prayer models of livestock and clay replicas of human limbs and organs, left as pleas for healing in a tradition that would persist in Greek religion for millennia. The mountain itself was the temple. The sky above it was the ceiling. No walls were needed because the deity was not contained within a building. She and the pronoun seems justified by the weight of the artistic evidence inhabited the earth the peaks the living rock, the same impulse drew the Minoans underground into the deep limestone caves that riddle the mountains of Crete. At sites like the Cameri Cave on Mount Ida and the Psychro Cave on the Lacythi Plateau, traditionally identified as the birthplace of Zeus in later Greek mythology, excavators found rich deposits of votive offerings, pottery, bronze figurines, double axes, and stone offering tables inscribed with the still unreadable Linear A script. These were not burial sites. They were places of active worship, dark passages that the Minoans appear to have understood as conduits to the underworld thresholds, where the living could communicate with the powers that governed fertility, death, and the renewal of life. The echo between these cave sanctuaries and the later Greek myth of the labyrinth, a dark subterranean place of passage and transformation, is difficult to ignore, though impossible to prove. What the archaeological record does suggest with reasonable confidence is that the Minoans experienced the divine as something immanent in the landscape, something rising from the earth and dwelling in the wild places of their island. And at the centre of that faith, with her snakes and her unblinking gaze, stood a figure whose power was rooted not in military conquest or political authority, but in the oldest force of all the capacity to give sustain and renew life. But the goddess was not alone in the Minoan sacred world. She shared it with a creature whose image appeared on every surface the Minoans touched, carved into seals, moulded onto vessels painted across the walls of the central courts. A creature that embodied not the nurturing power of the earth, but something wilder, more dangerous, and far more difficult to control. The dance with the bull. The horns appear everywhere, carved in stone and are mounted on the rooftops of palaces set on altars in small domestic shrines, incised into the faces of seal stones barely a centimetre wide. The stylized image of a bull's horns rendered as a simple U-shaped form, with upward curving tips, is the single most pervasive sacred symbol in the Minoan world. Evans called them horns of consecration, borrowing the language of later Greek religion, and the name has endured because no better one has been proposed. Wherever these horns appear, they seem to mark a boundary between the ordinary and the sacred, a threshold crossed not by walking through a gate, but by entering a space the bull had claimed. At Knossos, fragments of enormous stone horns were found in the rubble of the western court, suggesting that they once crowned the roofline of the palace itself, visible from a distance to anyone approaching the complex. The bull was not merely an animal the Minoans admired. It was an animal they placed at the architectural summit of their civilization, a creature whose image watched over the places where power was exercised and the divine was invoked. The bull's presence in Minoan art is relentless in its variety. On tiny seal stones, bulls are shown galloping, charging, turning their massive heads in poses that capture the rolling musculature of the animal with an anatomical precision that suggests long and careful observation. On ceremonial drinking vessels called rita, the bull's head is rendered in gold, silver, and carved stone. One famous example from Knossos, fashioned from black steatite, with gilded wooden horns and eyes inlaid with rock crystal, conveys the animal's raw power with a directness that feels almost confrontational. On pottery of the marine and naturalistic styles, bulls appear alongside dolphins, octopuses, and wild goats in a bestiary that celebrates the full spectrum of Cretan wildlife. But the bull occupies a different category. The dolphins are graceful, the goats are decorative, the bull is dangerous, and the Minoans, rather than avoiding that danger, appear to have built their most spectacular ritual around it. The bull-leaping fresco from Knossos is the single most debated image in all of Minoan art. Found in fragments in the eastern wing of the palace and painstakingly reconstructed, it depicts a scene of breathtaking and possibly impossible athleticism. A massive bull charges across the panel in a flying gallop, all four hooves lifted from the ground, in the artistic convention used to indicate speed. Three slender, long-limbed figures interact with the animal in what appears to be a coordinated sequence. At the front, a pale, skinned figure female by the Minoan colour convention that assigned white skin to women and reddish-brown to men grasps the bull's enormous horns. In the centre, a dark-skinned male figure executes a hands-free backflip over the animal's spine, his body arched in perfect mid-rotation. At the rear, a second pale-skinned female stands with arms outstretched, positioned to receive the vaulter as he lands. The composition is dynamic, rhythmic, and deeply strange, a frozen instant of what seems to be a death-defying performance involving both men and women conducted not on a battlefield, but in what was almost certainly a ritual context. The physical plausibility of the act depicted has been questioned for decades. Modern bullfighters and acrobats have pointed out that grasping the horns of a charging bull would be suicidal. The animal's instinctive reaction is to jerk its head violently upward, which would launch the athlete not over the back but into the air with catastrophic force. Some researchers have proposed that the fresco does not depict a single simultaneous moment, but rather a schematic sequence, 3 phases of a single leap, shown in one continuous image read from left to right like a comic strip. Others have suggested that the athletes approach from the side using the bull's lateral momentum, rather than meeting its charge head-on. Still others believe the animals used were younger, smaller, or specially conditioned, reducing the lethality of the encounter without eliminating its dramatic power. And a minority view holds that the entire scene is symbolic, a mythological representation of a cosmic struggle between human skill and natural force never literally performed at all. The question may never be settled, because the fresco is the only detailed visual record we possess of the practice, and the Minoans left no written explanation of what it meant. But the context in which the image was found and the broader pattern of bull imagery throughout Minoan culture suggests that whatever the bull leaping was literal or symbolic sport or sacrament, it occupied a position of supreme importance in the ceremonial life of the palaces. The great central courtyard at Knossos, with its flat paved surface and surrounding multi-storey facades, has long been identified as the most likely venue for such performances. If bull leaping did take place there, the spectacle would have been extraordinary. Young athletes, male and female, confronting the most powerful animal in the Cretan landscape, before an audience of priests, nobles, and perhaps the entire population of the palace complex watched from balconies and rooftop terraces that rose on every side like the tiers of an amphitheatre. It is in this image elite youths risking their lives against a bull in the heart of a labyrinthine palace that the historical seed of the Minotaur myth becomes most visible. The later Greek legend of 14 Athenian youths and maidens sent into the labyrinth to be devoured by a bull-headed monster may be a distorted, fearful memory of exactly this kind of ritual. The Minoans did not feed their young to a monster, they sent them to dance with one. The distinction matters because it transforms the meaning of the myth from a story about tyranny and sacrifice into a story about courage and sacred performance, a memory so old and so thoroughly filtered through the fears of a successor culture that its original character was inverted. What had been a celebration became in the retelling a punishment. What had been an act of grace became an act of horror. But whatever meaning the bull held for the Minoans, and without their own words we can only trace its outline, the creature's power in their imagination was inseparable from the island that sustained them both. The bull was the land wild and untamable. The fleet was the sea controlled and commanding, and it was between these two forces, the earth beneath and the water beyond, that the Minoan world held its extraordinary balance, a balance that one day the earth itself would shatter, the mountain that swallowed the sea. 70 miles north of Crete in the deep water of the southern Aegean, the island known today as Santorini curves in a broken crescent, around one of the largest volcanic calderas on Earth. The bay it encloses is not a natural harbour. It is a wound, the place where the centre of the island used to be before the earth opened and swallowed it. The cliffs that ring the caldera rise 300 metres from the waterline, their layered faces striped in bands of black lava-red scoria and pale pumice, a geological cross-section of eruption after eruption stacked across millennia. Modern cruise ships anchor in the flooded crater, and their passengers ride donkeys up switchback paths to whitewashed villages perched on the rim, most of them unaware that the picturesque bay beneath them was created by one of the most violent explosions in the recorded history of the planet. The Minoans knew this island as Thera. They built a city on its southern coast, and sometime in the late 17th or early 16th century BC, the precise date remains one of the most contentious debates in Bronze Age scholarship, the mountain at the island's heart detonated with a force estimated at several hundred times the power of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The city the Minoans built on Thera was called Akrotiri, and its excavation begun in 1967 by the Greek archaeologist Spiridon Mariniatos. revealed a settlement of remarkable sophistication preserved under meters of volcanic ash and pumice. The buildings were multi-storied, constructed from rubble masonry, reinforced with timber frames, and their interiors were finished with plastered walls painted in the full, Minoan fresco tradition landscapes, animals, ritual scenes, and the magnificent flotilla fresco that offers the most detailed image of Bronze Age seafaring in existence. The streets were paved and drained. The houses contained indoor plumbing. Storage rooms held rows of pithoi filled with provisions. Akrotiri was not a colonial outpost or a military garrison. It was a thriving, wealthy, permanent community, a Minoan city transplanted to a volcanic island, complete with the art, the architecture, and the infrastructure of the mother civilization on Crete. And then, in a detail that carries a quiet, particular horror, the excavators noticed something missing. In all the rooms they cleared beneath all the fallen roofs and collapsed upper stories, they found not a single human body. The streets were empty, the beds were overturned, pots lay smashed on floors, but every person was gone. The earthquakes that preceded the eruption and volcanologists confirm that major eruptions are almost always preceded by weeks or months of seismic activity, had given the inhabitants enough warning to flee. They gathered what they could carry and they left. Where they went, no record tells us. Whether they survived what followed is another question entirely. The eruption itself unfolded in phases, each more destructive than the last. The initial explosive phase sent a column of ash and pumice more than 20 miles into the stratosphere, a plume so high it would have been visible from Egypt. Fine volcanic ash began to drift southeast on the prevailing winds falling over the eastern Mediterranean, in a pale, gritty snow that dimmed the sunlight and contaminated open water sources. On Thera itself, the city of Akrotiri was buried under a thick blanket of pumice that crushed upper stories, but preserved ground floor rooms and their contents in a near-perfect time capsule. But the worst was yet to come. As the eruption continued, the magma chamber beneath the volcano emptied catastrophically, and the unsupported roof of the mountain collapsed inward. The entire central portion of the island fell into the sea, displacing an almost incomprehensible volume of water and generating a series of tsunamis that radiated outward across the Aegean at speeds that would have given coastal populations virtually no time to react. On the northern coast of Crete, the closest major landmass, the effects were devastating. At the site of Plakastro in eastern Crete, excavations have revealed a chaotic layer of destruction, volcanic tephra, mixed with building debris scattered far inland by the force of a massive wave. The harbour installations of the northern coast, which served as the primary interface between the Minoan fleet and the open sea, would have been directly in the path of the incoming water. The ships that were the foundation of Minoan power, the wooden walls of their thalassocracy, were likely smashed in their anchorages, broken apart in a matter of hours. The wave itself would have receded, but the damage to the maritime infrastructure was not the kind that could be repaired in a single season. Shipyards, docks, warehouses, and the accumulated material of a naval power built over centuries, all of it vulnerable, all of it concentrated along the very coastline the tsunami struck first and hardest. The ashfall compounded the disaster in ways that extended far beyond the immediate destruction. A thick layer of volcanic tephra settled over the eastern half of Crete, contaminating agricultural land-poisoning water sources for both humans and livestock, and rendering once fertile fields temporarily unusable. Crops failed. The carefully managed surplus of olive oil and grain that had filled the palace magazines, the stored wealth of the Minoan economy, could not be replenished in a landscape choked with ash. Famine or something close to it would have followed in the eastern part of the island. And above everything, for weeks or perhaps months after the eruption, the sky itself was wrong. The massive injection of sulfur dioxide and fine particulate matter into the stratosphere would have created a volcanic winter, a dimming of sunlight, a cooling of temperatures, a persistent haze that turned the familiar blue Aegean sky into something grey, alien, and deeply unsettling. For a people whose art and religion celebrated the beauty of the natural world, whose goddess was the living earth, whose power came from the open sea, the eruption of Thera was not merely a natural disaster. It was in the most literal sense they could have understood the failure of everything they believed in. But the Earth had not finished with them. The eruption was the wound. What came afterwards, slowly over decades in the weakened space the volcano had opened, was something the Minoans could see approaching, but may no longer have had the strength to resist. The long twilight. For decades after the eruption, the common understanding among historians was clean and dramatic. The volcano destroyed the Minoans in a single catastrophic blow, a Bronze Age Pompeii on a civilizational scale. The story had the appeal of narrative symmetry, a great culture undone by a great disaster, its end as vivid and sudden as its art. But the archaeology of the late 20th century told a more complicated and, in its way, more sorrowful story. The Minoan civilization did not die on the day Thera erupted, it lingered. For perhaps a century and a half after the explosion, life on Crete continued diminished, wounded, stripped of its former confidence, but not yet extinguished. The palaces still functioned. The administrative tablets were still inscribed. Trade in reduced and altered form still moved through whatever harbours had survived or been rebuilt. What the eruption had destroyed was not the body of the civilization, but something less visible, and far harder to restore: the systems, the networks, and perhaps the belief that had held the body together. The archaeological evidence draws a careful geographic distinction. In the eastern half of the island, where the ashfall was heaviest, and the tsunami struck with greatest force, the destruction was severe and the recovery was slow. Coastal settlements like Castro show clear evidence of devastation, followed by only partial rebuilding, smaller structures, poorer materials, a diminished population. The fertile plains of the east, once among the most productive agricultural zones on the island, may have taken years or even decades to recover from the contamination of their soil and water sources. But in central and western Crete, the heartland of the palace civilization, the picture is different. Knossos shows no significant ash layer from the Thera eruption. The palace was not levelled by the blast, not buried by tephra, not washed away by the tsunami. Its walls still stood. Its storerooms still held their pithoi. The administrative machinery of the state, however weakened, continued to operate. This geographic disparity is crucial because it means the Minoan collapse was not a single event, but a process, a slow unravelling of the interconnected systems that had sustained the civilization during its centuries of prosperity. The most damaging loss was almost certainly the fleet. A thalassocracy depends on its ships the way an agrarian kingdom depends on its fields. The Minoan navy was not merely a military asset. It was the circulatory system of the entire economy, the mechanism by which Cretan olive oil and wine reached Egypt, by which Cypriot copper and Anatolian tin reached the workshops at Knossos, by which the network of Aegean colonies and trading posts remained connected to the mother island. The destruction of a significant portion of this fleet in the harbours of the northern coast would have been an economic catastrophe of the first order, severing trade routes that had operated for generations and cutting off the flow of raw materials on which Minoan metallurgy and craft production depended. Rebuilding a fleet of that scale required not only timber labour and time, but also the organisational capacity and accumulated maritime knowledge that had taken centuries to develop. A wounded bureaucracy governing a traumatised population with diminished agricultural resources may simply not have been capable of restoring what had been lost. The second wound was less tangible, but perhaps equally fatal. The Minoans, as far as their art allows us to judge, understood the world as a place of beauty, abundance, and divine generosity. Their goddess was the living earth. Their rituals celebrated the power of nature in its most vital forms: the bull's strength, the snake's renewal, the sea's bounty. The eruption of Thera was an assault on every one of these beliefs. The earth had torn itself apart. The sea had risen against the shore. The sky had turned dark and the fields had been poisoned. For a people whose entire spiritual framework rested on a covenant of harmony between human civilization and the natural world, the eruption would have been not just a physical disaster but a theological crisis, a sign that the covenant was broken, that the powers they worshipped had turned hostile or indifferent. Such crises of faith in any era destabilize the authority of the institutions that claim to mediate between the human and the divine. If the priests and rulers of the palaces could not prevent the catastrophe, could not explain it, could not restore the world to its former order, then on what basis did they deserve obedience? The question may never have been asked aloud, but its pressure would have been felt in every interaction between the palace administration and the population it governed. Into this weakened landscape, a new power was expanding. On the Greek mainland, the Mycenaean civilization, younger, more militaristic, organised around fortified citadels and warrior aristocracies, had been growing in strength throughout the 15th century BC. The Mycenaeans had long been in contact with the Minoans, absorbing their artistic techniques, their religious symbols, and their administrative methods. But the relationship was shifting. As the Minoan grip on the Aegean sea lanes loosened, Mycenaean ships began to fill the void trading raiding and establishing their own presence on islands and coastal sites that had once been firmly within the Minoan sphere. The evidence of this transition appears most clearly in the archaeological record at Knossos itself, where the final phase of the palace's existence shows unmistakable signs of Mycenaean administration. The Linear B tablets, Greek language records written in an adapted Minoan script, date from this period, documenting a palace that still functioned as an administrative centre but was now operated by Greek-speaking rulers who had either conquered or co-opted the existing Minoan power structure. The Mycenaeans who took control of Knossos were not barbarians dismantling a civilization they did not understand. They were something more nuanced, and in a way more poignant inheritors who admired what they had taken. They adopted Minoan fresco techniques to decorate their own halls, though they replaced the leaping dolphins and flowering landscapes with scenes of war hunting and armoured processions. They kept the Minoan bureaucratic system adapting its script to their own language. They preserved the sacred symbols, the horns of consecration, the double axe incorporating them into their own shrines alongside the ancestors of the Olympian gods, whose names appear for the first time on the Linear B tablets: Zeus, Hera, Poseidon. The Minoan world was not erased. It was absorbed, translated, and transformed by a culture that recognised its brilliance even as it replaced its foundations. But the palace at Knossos, even under its new masters, was living on borrowed time. And when the end came, it arrived not from the sea or the sky, but most likely from the hand of another human being in a final act of violence that would close the Bronze Age chapter of Crete forever: the fire and the thread. Around the year 1375 BC, the date is approximate as all Bronze Age dates must be the palace of Knossos burned for the last time. The fire was not a minor incident, not a kitchen blaze that spread through a wooden storeroom, not the localised damage of a toppled oil lamp. It was total. The conflagration tore through the entire 6-acre complex with an intensity that blackened. Stone, shattered frescoes collapsed the grand staircase into rubble and consumed the great red wooden columns that had held the roofs of the palace for more than 5 centuries. When the flames finally died, what remained was a smouldering ruin, walls standing to varying heights, floors buckled by heat, storerooms full of charred pythoi cracked open by the temperatures. The palace that Arthur Evans would begin to excavate 23 centuries later was in essence the skeleton left behind by this fire. Knossos was not abandoned, gradually not slowly emptied by a dwindling population. It was destroyed in a single violent episode, and it was never rebuilt. The question of who set the fire, or whether it was set at all, remains one of the unresolved problems of Aegean archaeology. The leading theories divide along a familiar fault line between human agency and natural catastrophe, though in this case, the evidence tilts heavily toward human hands. An earthquake is the most commonly proposed natural cause, and Crete is certainly one of the most seismically active regions in the Mediterranean, but the destruction of 1375 BC does not fit the pattern of earthquake damage seen at other Cretan sites. The other palaces and towns on the island do not show evidence of simultaneous destruction at this date. If a major earthquake had struck, its effects would have been widespread, not confined to a single complex. The fire at Knossos appears to have been a local event, catastrophic in its intensity, but limited in its geographic scope. This points away from a natural disaster and toward a deliberate act. Some scholars have proposed an internal uprising, a rebellion of the native Minoan population against their Mycenaean overlords, a final desperate attempt to reclaim the palace that had been the centre of their world for centuries. The scenario is plausible but unprovable. Others have suggested that the destruction came from outside a raid by a rival Mycenaean power, perhaps from the citadel of Mycenae itself seeking to eliminate a competing centre of authority, and consolidate control over the lucrative Aegean trade routes. This too is plausible and equally unprovable. The fire consumed whatever evidence might have distinguished one cause from the other, leaving behind only the fact of destruction and the silence that followed. What the fire did not consume, and this is one of the quiet ironies that archaeology occasionally offers, were the clay tablets. The Linear B record stored in the palace archives had been written on sun-dried clay, a material that under normal conditions would have dissolved back into mud within a few years of being discarded. But the intense heat of the final conflagration baked those soft tablets as hard as kiln-fired pottery, preserving them in a state that would endure for millennia. The documents that survived were not grand chronicles or royal proclamations. They were the last administrative records of the palace's final days, inventories of bronze vessels, lists of textile workers, allocations of grain and oil rosters of military equipment, including chariots and their component parts. They are the paperwork of a functioning bureaucracy frozen at the moment of its destruction, and they carry the particular poignancy of mundane things preserved by catastrophe. Someone was counting chariot wheels on the day the palace burned. Someone was recording the distribution of rations to a group of women workers whose names, written in an archaic Greek we can now read, have survived longer than anything else about their lives. After the fire, people continue to live in small settlements, around the ruins of Knossos, and in other parts of the island for generations. But the centralized palace civilization, the system that had organized religion, trade, art and administration under a single sprawling roof, was finished. Crete became a provincial backwater of the Mycenaean world, and when that world itself collapsed in the general catastrophe of the late Bronze Age around 1200 BC, the island sank into a long, dark age from which it would not emerge for centuries. The great palaces decayed into mounds of rubble covered by wind-blown soil, and eventually by the roots of olive trees and wild scrub. The frescoes crumbled, the scripts were forgotten. The memory of what had existed on this island was compressed over generations into myth, and the myth itself was reshaped by the culture that replaced the Minoans, until the original meaning was almost unrecognizable beneath the layers of Greek reinterpretation. The labyrinth became a prison. The bull leaping became a sacrifice. The great thalassocrat became a tyrant. The palace that had stood open to the world became in the Greek imagination a place of darkness from which no one returned. Only the thread of the story itself survived, thin, fragile winding through 30 centuries of retelling, connecting the classical Greeks, however distantly, to a world they could no longer see, and a language they could no longer hear. And when Arthur Evans followed that thread back to its source in the spring of 1900, what he found was not the lair of a monster, but the remains of a civilization that had filled its walls with dolphins, its shrines with goddesses, and its courtyards with the sound of the young athletes leaping over the horns of bulls. A civilization whose artists painted on wet plaster with a confidence that allowed no second attempt, whose potters shaped vessels so thin that light passed through them, whose sailors commanded a fleet that made stone walls unnecessary, whose scribes wrote in a language that we can hold in our hands but cannot yet hear spoken aloud. The Minoans remain, after more than a century of excavation, a civilization defined as much by what we do not know as by what we do. Their language is silent. Their religion can only be guessed at through the objects they left behind. The full story of their decline is still debated in the pages of academic journals and at conferences where scholars disagree politely and persistently about dates, causes, and meanings. The snake goddess still stares from her glass case in the Heraklion Museum with eyes that offer no explanation. The Phaistos disc still turns its spiral of stamped symbols toward anyone willing to look, daring them to find a pattern that 3,000 years of silence has not yet surrendered. They are a people we can see in extraordinary detail, their faces, their clothes, their animals, their ships, but whose own words remain just beyond the reach of understanding. Perhaps one day a new venturist will find the key to Linear A, and the Minoans will speak to us at last in their own voice. Perhaps the tablets will reveal prayers or king lists, or something entirely unexpected, something that overturns the careful interpretations built from a century of silent evidence. Or perhaps the silence will hold and the Minoans will remain what they have been since the last fire burned at Knossos, a beautiful, brilliant civilization glimpsed through painted fragments, and the fading echo of a myth close enough to touch, but never quite close enough to know. Somewhere in a drawer of the Heraclean Archaeological Museum, in a tray lined with soft cotton, there are seal stones small enough to be mistaken for pebbles. They are the same kind of stones that women once sold in the markets of Athens as good luck charms, milkstones they called them, not knowing what they were. Under a magnifying glass, each one still carries its tiny cargo of images. A priestess with arms raised a ship with a curving stern, a bull caught in the middle of a turn. The hands that carved them have been dust for 35 centuries. The language that named the carvers has never been spoken aloud in the modern world, but the stones remain warm-coloured smooth from long handling patient in the way that only very old things can be. They were the first clue, they are still in a sense the last. We have followed those clues across the better part of an evening through the painted corridors of Knossos across the open sea of the Minoan thalassocracy, into the dark caves, where offerings were left for powers we cannot name, and through the ash-choked silence that followed the eruption of Thera. We have looked at frescoes that capture a world of extraordinary colour and motion, and we have stood before tablets inscribed with a script that keeps its secrets with the calm finality of stone. And if at the end of all this the Minoans remain not fully known, if their religion is still a matter of inference, their political structure still debated, their language still unreadable, that is not a failure of the evidence or of our attention. It is simply the condition of the past when enough time has elapsed. 3,500 years is a long silence. It would be stranger in a way if everything were clear. What we can say is that something remarkable existed on that island. A civilization that chose to paint dolphins on the walls of its private rooms instead of battle scenes. A people who built their centres of power without fortification, trusting the sea to be their shield. A culture whose religious imagery placed women at the centre of the sacred world with a consistency that has no parallel in the ancient Mediterranean. A tradition of craftsmanship so refined that a potter could shape a vessel thin enough to see light through, and a painter could render a living figure on wet plaster with no room to correct a single line. These things are not speculation. They are preserved in the physical record, fragile, fragmentary, but real, and if they do not add up to a complete portrait, they add up to something that matters, the knowledge that the story of early Europe was not only written by warriors and walled cities. There was another way. It lasted for centuries, and then it was almost entirely forgotten. Perhaps the most honest thing to say about the Minoans is that they are a civilization we have learned to see, but not yet learned to hear. The frescoes show us their faces. The architecture shows us how they moved through space. The pottery and the seal stones show us what they valued and what they traded. But the voice behind all of it, the language in which they named their gods, sang to their children, argued with their neighbours and recorded the things they considered worth remembering, that voice is still waiting in the unread lines of Linear A. Whether it will ever speak again is something no one can promise, but the tablets are there in their museum cases, and somewhere in the world there may be a mind that will one day find the pattern the rest of us have missed. And now the corridors are quiet. The painted griffins guard an empty throne. The great central court at Knossos lies open under a sky that has been blue and clear and indifferent for a very long time. Somewhere on the northern coast the sea moves against a shore it once tried to destroy, and the waves carry nothing now but salt and light. Let that be enough for tonight, traveller. You have walked a long way through a world that asked more questions than it answered, and that is the honest shape of history, not a straight road to a conclusion, but a winding path through rooms that open onto other rooms. Let the thread unwind from your hand now. Let the labyrinth keep what it keeps. The stones will still be there in the morning, holding their small carved images, waiting with the patience of things that have already outlasted everything except time itself. Rest well. Let the night settle over you like the fine white dust that once covered the fields of Crete, quiet, weightless, and slowly giving way to whatever grows next.